Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on Bronze Age Empires. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to look at the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia. So, we'll go ahead and start with the time prior to the Bronze Age, the Neolithic, and talk about what the Neolithic Revolution actually means. From there, we'll witness the rise of civilization in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. We'll move on as those kind of smaller states grow into an empire, and we'll wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. So let's start with the Neolithic Revolution. Now we're going to go back even before that to start. When did people arise? All right, so the idea here is that we started walking upright. According to kind of biological anthropologists, we started walking upright about 4 million years ago. And then humans arose about 200,000 years ago. All right? And so around 200,000 years ago, we get the rise of Homo sapiens, and for 190,000 years of our existence, we live life pretty much the same way. We're nomads. And what that means is that we spend most of our time following around animals, trying to kill them and eat them, all right? Eating is like the number one thing in life, and we go wander around the earth trying to feed our bellies. Now, in the meantime, we develop a couple things like art and maybe religion with these kind of fertility goddesses and these wall paintings, but in general, it's looking for food and moving around to do so. Now, the last ice age ended about 12,000 years ago, around 10,000 BC. And with this kind of climate change that occurred as things got warmer, a couple things happened. As things got warmer, the number of people around increased. And the number of large animals, right, like these woolly mammoths, decreased. And so now all of a sudden, when you used to go around trying to hunt woolly mammoths to feed your belly, now you're following them over to kind of across the river, and all of a sudden there's more people there. And those people say, no, those are our woolly mammoths, you can't have them. And so people start to think that rather than follow these animals around, the few that are left, what if they just invest a little bit more in the land that they already have? And this is what's known as the Neolithic Revolution. And it consists of three major things. So first, it consists of people settling down into permanent settlements. And again, this is all happening around 10,000 BC to start, maybe 9,000 BC, but right around that time. But people settle down in settlements, they start farming, right? They just tend a little bit more to the plants that are there, eventually kind of going into larger scale farming. And they domesticate animals. And you don't have to chase woolly mammoths anymore if you've got like cows that you can fence in and you know where they are at all points in time. Now, the Neolithic Revolution has a kind of cyclical effect on things. Now all of a sudden, once you're in a single place, you can store food, right? You don't have to carry it all with you, you can store it somewhere. And so what that means is that you end up with a little extra food. Now you can store it, and so the next time there's a drought or a famine, you've got food to eat already. That allows for more people to be born, and now that you've got more people, you can take a couple of those, and they can do something than just try to produce food. And they can do things like make art, or advance technology, or create a political system, or dabble in religion, right? A lot of different things, but it's that extra kind of food that leads to more people, that leads to labor specialization, and that ultimately leads to technological advances because you have people who can do things other than just produce food. And guess what? As technology improves, then you can produce more food. And then you have even more stability, and the cycle goes around and around and around. So, our type site for the Neolithic is known as Çatalhöyük, and this is in modern-day Turkey, in the southern part of modern-day Turkey. And it was flourishing in kind of the 6000s BC, the 7th millennium BC. Now, you see a recreation of it here, and so you'll notice it was a fairly large site. Something like 5,000 to 10,000 people would have lived here. And we think that they were heavily into religion because some of the big things they're finding are these kind of little goddess figurines. They find bull skulls everywhere in the houses, and they also find red ochre on some of the burials. Now, how do we get from that to kind of the great civilizations of the ancient Near East? Well, first let's talk a little bit about kind of what the characteristics are of this Bronze Age, of this kind of rise of civilization. One is the switch to cities. And you can kind of see here just how different this looks than the Çatalhöyük settlement. So we get people living in cities of up to 50, 70, 80,000 now. And it's changing not just the number of people there, but the layout of the cities themselves. So take a second and look at the two kind of side by side. So here we have Neolithic Çatalhöyük, and here we have Bronze Age Uruk, and you can kind of look at the similarities and differences. So they've both got houses, they both cover a fair amount of space, but all of a sudden over here, right, we end up with monumental architecture, right? We've got the delineation of public and private space, right? These are these kind of public buildings. It looks like a space for religion or politics. We've got open gathering spaces for people. And so the specialization of space in these Bronze Age cities ends up being kind of much more nuanced than what we're getting in the Neolithic. Now, we also see the political hierarchy emerge, all right? And this happens because people need to basically coordinate on large projects. If you look at where Bronze Age civilizations arise to begin with, you're looking at the Nile River Valley, and you're looking at the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys. And the project that they're trying to coordinate is essentially irrigation. So people have been farming for a while. Now they're trying to irrigate based on these rivers so that they can produce more food and they can produce food more stably. But in order to coordinate an irrigation project, you have to have somebody who actually does the coordination, and you have to have other people who do the work. And we think in large part this is how political hierarchies arose. One person kind of coordinating these irrigation projects, the other people doing the work, and then over time this kind of division becoming ingrained in society. Along with the kind of political advances, we see priesthoods arise as well. And this ends up being very, very kind of closely linked to political advantage as well. So political rulers claim that they get the right to rule from the gods, and then the priests are there to kind of reinforce that. And now we see kind of a controlled access to who has access to who can get in touch with the gods. War becomes professionalized, right? We end up seeing larger armies than had ever been seen previously. And then we have new technology like the chariots that we get with the Hittites and the Egyptians. And we see stratification. You'll notice if you look back at that kind of settlement of Çatalhöyük, all the houses looked about the same. But now we'd have small houses for farmers and much larger houses for government officials. And in between those guys, we have craftsmen and merchants. We have scribes and soldiers, eventually leading to the pharaoh or the political leader at the top of the socioeconomic pyramid. We get monumental architecture, right? Whether that's the pyramids of Giza or the ziggurats of the Near East or the palaces of the Aegean world. And so you can see the Minoan palace over here on the left and the Mycenaean fortress at Mycenae over here on the right. And we get technological and artistic innovation. So we name the thing the Bronze Age because we've got these bronze tools, but there are a wide variety of other inventions as well, right? So we've got this kind of advances in art and sculpture. We end up with writing, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we end up with things like the wheel, right? And that birth of writing ends up being really, really important. And we see it in a bunch of different places. So we get hieroglyphs down in Egypt, cuneiform in the Near East. We get linear A on the island of Crete in Minoan culture, and linear B on the Greek mainland with the Mycenaean culture. And ask yourself, right, why is writing the most important of these inventions we've just talked about? Well, because now all of a sudden, you have the ability to transfer knowledge across space and time, right? Now all of a sudden, when you die, your knowledge doesn't die with you. And what that means is the next generation isn't starting from scratch. They've got the know-how to already start. Imagine if you were trying to build a computer, right? And somebody knew how to, and then they died, and then you had to start all over again. But instead, the first person who built it transferred his knowledge, wrote it down how you do it, and now you can do it without having to start from square one. So let's look at some of these Bronze Age empires. So we'll start in Mesopotamia, very literally the land between the rivers, right? It's the Greek word meso meaning middle, and Potamia, potamos meaning rivers. So we've got the Euphrates down in the south and the Tigris to the north. And this is the homeland of kind of the earliest large-scale civilizations in this part of the world. And we're going to take a look at the Sumerians. And the Sumerians started down here in the kind of southeastern part of these two rivers and touching upon the Persian Gulf. Now, when we talk about the Sumerians, it's almost like we're talking about Greece in the sense that these are independent city-states. So it's not like one rules everybody, it's not like an empire. They all share a religion and a culture and a language, but they're independently governed. And one of the most powerful of these city-states was the site of Uruk. And this lasted from the 3000s BC all the way down until like the later 3rd millennium BC. But it peaked right around kind of 2900. And this was the site, this was the homeland of the kind of mythical ruler Gilgamesh. And at its peak, it had something like 50 to 80,000 people. And so this is just on a totally different scale than we saw in Çatalhöyük, right? So we can see it over here. And once again, when we look at this kind of comparison, we've got a bunch of houses, but here we get the differentiation of space into public monumental buildings like the ziggurat, public spaces for meeting people, and then private land all the way around the outside. Now those ziggurats, those are both kind of religious and political structures, right? They're a way to kind of show the power of religion and the ruler. And so what you're looking at here is from the site of Uruk, you can see the archaeological remains of one of these ziggurats, right? A little bit worse for wear as the mud brick is disintegrated over time. But when you look at kind of what this would have looked like in antiquity, it's really quite an impressive structure. And people think, once again, that perhaps this kind of is a recreation of one of these kind of early mounds. Now, the rulers would have justified their right to rule, not by saying, hey, I'm telling you how to irrigate, but rather by saying, I'm one of the gods. And if I'm not a god, I'm definitely a descendant of the god. And if I'm not a descendant of the god, well, the gods have told me I have the right to rule anyway. So there's this very, very close connection between political rulership and kind of religious power. Now, when it comes to writing, we talked a little bit about why it's so important. And early on, writing is used primarily for record keeping, right? It's kind of like an accounting system. But later, we finally get the development of what we consider literature, right? Narrative stories. And one of the earliest is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This was likely written down in the latter part of the 3rd millennium BC, but it's set much, much earlier, about a millennium earlier in the site of Uruk. And it tells the story of this hero Gilgamesh, and at first his friend Enkidu, and eventually a series of kind of mythical challenges against beasts that he faced on his way to the search for everlasting life. And if you ever read the story, it turns out he doesn't find that everlasting life. Now, the Sumerians developed some of the key kind of like technological and scientific discoveries of the day. So we've got things like the wheel that starts around 3500 BC. And interestingly, the wheel wasn't at first used for transportation, right? You'd think it'd be used for like a wagon or something. Originally, it was actually used as like a potter's wheel, right? It would spin like horizontally like that. And only later did they start to attach it to carts and animals. We've got the bronze itself, right? Gives name to the entire period. And then we've got the development of this kind of Sumerian language in cuneiform script. And cuneiform is the name for that wedge-shaped writing. It literally means that kind of wedge-shaped writing. And after 700 years of being the predominant civilization in the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys, the Sumerians eventually give way to the Akkadians. Now, we can see the Sumerians down there at the very, very kind of the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Akkadians take over the entire region. And so the big development here is that we're moving away from these kind of independently governed city-states that share culture towards the world's first empire, a single group ruling a diverse set of people. Now, the ruler that we want to kind of keep in mind with the Akkadians is this guy right here, Sargon the Great. He's the first of the Akkadian rulers, and he's the one who's able to put together that kind of contiguous area of hegemony. And he's so powerful, and he's such a good conqueror that 1,500 years later, the Neo-Assyrians are still looking back at Sargon of Akkad, or Sargon the Great, as kind of the prototypical conqueror of antiquity. Now the Akkadians eventually give way, and they give way to two different groups, the Assyrians up here in the north and the Babylonians down in the south. And eventually Babylon is able to put together kind of the southern part of the Akkadian Empire, and this is what we call the Old Babylonian Empire. We see them again later on under Nebuchadnezzar, but early on they're down here in the first part of the second millennium BC. And the guy to remember for the Old Babylonian Empire is, of course, Hammurabi, the guy who created the law code. And so Hammurabi's code is very, very important for civilization because now we have written law. And what this ends up meaning, even though it's a fairly harsh kind of thing, is that everybody's got to play by the same rules. Now, maybe not the same rules, that's maybe the wrong way to put it, but they have to play by the rules that are written down. Now, you've probably heard of Hammurabi's code as this idea of an eye for an eye. And to some extent, that's true. But we also have in here that the exact kind of punishments for different crimes vary dramatically based on who's committing them and who they're committed against. So if you're a lower class person, right, and you commit a crime against an upper class person, it certainly is an eye for an eye. But if you're an upper class person and you do something maybe not so right to a lower class person, well, then all of a sudden you might be able to just pay them off with a fine. So it's not quite the eye for an eye thing that we learn about in the elementary school textbooks. And then finally we have the Hittite Empire. And to kind of get the Hittite Empire, we've got to move north and west from where we were with the Babylonians. And so they're one of the first empires in the region of Anatolia that we associate with modern-day Turkey. Now the Hittites are the first ones to use iron. And one of the things they're known for is being almost constantly at war. And so the Hittites are the first ones to invent these kind of war chariots, and eventually they become kind of vicious in battle. And in 1274 BC, we end up seeing a kind of chariot-based battle between the Hittites of Anatolia and the New Kingdom Egyptians. And this is as both of them kind of spread from their homeland, right? Anatolia moving south, and then Egypt moving north, and they collide in the Levant at the site of Kadesh. And I won't ruin the outcome of that battle for you. You can read that for yourself. So let's wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. So, it's the need for coordination for large-scale projects, specifically irrigation, that takes us from sites like Çatalhöyük, where you have a lot of people living together, and farming, but basically all the same, to the kind of differentiated, complex, stratified world of the ancient Near Eastern empires of the Bronze Age. And things like agriculture and writing, well, they're not just one-time developments. Although they develop, what we see is this sets off kind of a cycle of kind of growth, right? Where food surplus leads to stability, stability leads to population growth leads to people who can specialize, and specialization leads to new technology, which then leads to food surplus, and the cycle continues. Same thing with something like writing. Somebody invents something, right? They write it down. The next person who's doing the inventing doesn't have to start from scratch. They can start from what's already been written down. And that allows for kind of the growth of complexity and stratification and technology and wealth and the kind of monumental architecture and empires we see in the Bronze Age empires.